So I am Hannah Brackey, the Director of Product Management here at LabKey, and today I'm going to be talking with you about setting up your lab for success this year. And a few things, if you haven't heard of LabKey or have just sort of been interested in our company, we are a scientific data management software company that really specializes in tools to help scientists do their work. And we have a suite of products that really help support labs that are just getting started out in terms of their data management journey, with freezer management up to ELNs, LIMS-like functionality, as well as our platform scientific data management system. And what we mean by setting up your lab for success this year is really being prepared for changes that may come. There was a recent survey that polled scientists, and about 50% of labs are expecting an increase in spending this year. And at the same time, about half of those labs are also looking to be more efficient with their spending. And so one of the ways to be more efficient with your spending, as well as sort of anticipate potential growth, is with a really good change management method. And so that's what we're going to be talking mostly about today. So by having these effective change management systems, you can really help provide sustainable growth for your lab, as well as smooth any transitions that may happen in the year. There are three sources of change that we're going to be talking about today: incoming or new or expanding projects that labs might be undertaking, an increase or change in regulations, such as the new NIH DMS policy, as well as sort of the inevitable, for some of us, turnover of staff or gaining new staff as well. Before we kind of jump into these, what we'd like to recommend is really being able to establish a baseline in your lab on what the current needs are of the team. So firstly, being able to catalog your materials, such as samples and inventory, and even equipment within your lab, getting that sense of how many samples you are housing at the moment, how many samples you might be expecting for those new projects, and being able to track the amount of inventory or purchasing that you did in the last year. Being able to capture that past usage of both your inventory, but then also equipment. Do you have pieces of equipment that have not been used in a while that may need additional maintenance this year, or equipment that is ready to be retired? Or do you have sort of pieces of equipment like centrifuges that are used multiple times a day, where it might be useful to consider additional equipment to help support lab growth? Defining the needs of the current projects. So the best way to be able to scale for change is making sure that the current needs are met within the lab. And so making sure that all of those are taken care of as well. Understanding the staff capacity. So this ability to look at your staff time realistically and see how that time is being spent and how much more work can be sort of accommodated within the current FTEs that you have. And then lastly, identifying any current lab pain points. So if there's current problems with work in the lab, or challenges that people might be running into in terms of efficiency, being able to identify those now, because it's potentially going to be exacerbated by growth in the future as well. So really identifying those and hopefully being able to manage those in some way. And of course, we're a scientific data management software company, so I'm definitely going to recommend that a sample management or a software system is going to be really helpful for you as a lab to establish this baseline. If you don't have one already this year, really consider something for the coming year, so you'll be able to do this more smoothly in the future. So I'd like to see kind of what some changes that folks in the lab are expecting now. So let me launch this poll and I'll give you guys a couple minutes to answer. In the meantime, I'm going to get kind of started with new projects, and we'll take a look at this poll in a slide or two here. So this first one that we described is really around sort of those newer expanding projects. And as we all know, these can be triggered by a lot of different things, such as new collaborations. If you are receiving a new grant or part of a multi-year grant, and there's additional funding that comes with that. And then any rotating grad students for folks that are in academic institutions. And the sort of primary downstream effects of getting a new project or having projects ramp up is your materials changes. So things may increase in terms of the volume that you're expecting, but you may also be getting different materials within the lab, maybe something new that you haven't managed before. Having changes in protocols or potentially additions in protocols, maybe trying to do new experiments or making modifications to existing experiments. And then, of course, that need for equipment. Do you have the equipment that is sort of needed for these protocols, or do you have enough equipment to sort of manage the scale of these projects? And so it looks like from the poll results that most of you are actually expecting change this year, which is a little bit expected, but also kind of great that you're here. I see that most folks are anticipating this first one here on newer expanding projects. So it's glad to be able to answer some of these questions for you. So in terms of managing those materials at scale, again, we're going to recommend finding a system for tracking those laboratory samples and inventory. And when you're looking for systems, or when you're even creating your own system, what you want to be mindful of, particularly with samples, is creating a way to uniquely register those samples. So this is also called accessioning in a lot of places. Making sure that you can be flexible and capture the data that matters to you about those samples. All samples are not created equal, and certainly different labs have different interest for the type of samples that are coming into the lab. Making sure that you can also track where these samples are going and make your life a little bit easier as those samples can scale and being able to easily retrieve them. Creating SOPs around things that you might do with these samples, such as registration or receipt, processing the samples, and then, of course, storing them. Also making sure that staff has been trained on those SOPs when they're available. For inventory, really kind of similar to samples, but additional things that you may really care about here is this ability to identify when you need to order new inventory. So creating systems like Six Sigma models that allow you to keep a really lean lab, but also have the inventory that you need on hand. Tracking those amounts of those samples, again, to kind of trigger ordering or creation of new inventory items, as well as expiration dates on those critical reagents to ensure that you have the best integrity on the inventory when you're using it. And then really creating a shared laboratory environment where everybody in the lab can help contribute to the amount of inventory that's getting used and when inventory needs to get ordered. So creating a shared space or a spreadsheet or inventory tracking system that folks can help contribute to as they're using those reagents will reduce the administrative burden on, one or two people doing the ordering in the lab. So in terms of managing new protocols or creating experiments, definitely standardizing those experiments with SOPs is going to help with efficiency of the work within the lab, as well as reproducibility of results. So if you can create standardized SOPs, and then of course train staff, that's going to be primarily the best way to sort of scale up as needed. When you're considering documentation or SOPs, make sure that you're also identifying those areas of possible deviation. And so when things go wrong, when you may not have enough of a blood sample that comes in, what should the staff do in that case? Do they proceed? Is there sort of a minimum versus maximum? If somebody makes a mistake, how is that handled and documented? Make sure that you're also reviewing these with your staff before they get finalized. Make sure that this is what's actually happening within the lab and really get their buy-in. And that's going to help with sort of downstream compliance to the SOPs as well. And then make sure to have a system that you can regularly review these SOPs and then update as necessary. It's very unlikely that things stay the same for years and years without changes in, potential reagents or small changes in protocols. So making sure that those are updated to get the most accurate depiction of reality is a really good idea. And then, of course, training your staff on these SOPs or the experiments that are within the lab. Create a training plan on how this might work. Is somebody going to shadow a subject matter expert and then potentially be shadowed by that person and then perform it on their own? Do you have QCs in place to ensure that the training was successful, or how are you measuring those, the training? And then in addition to sort of reviewing those SOPs, make sure that you're regularly retraining as well to avoid lab shift. And, as experiments are passed from one scientist to another, there's often very small incremental changes that happen in how they do things that may affect the integrity of the data over time. And then also make sure that you have the inventory and equipment required, right? So you may be having a brand new experiment that requires some new items to either purchase or find within your organization. And for equipment, really, again, kind of making sure that you know what equipment you have and how often it gets used and what those maintenance logs are and making sure that it's sort of functional when you need it, essentially. So the first thing to do, kind of as we've set the baseline, be able to catalog all that critical equipment, make sure that you know where it is, especially in dispersed labs where there might be many rooms or even buildings where laboratory equipment is. Ensure that you know what those are, as well as sort of maintenance logs on that equipment. Make sure you understand kind of how it's used and consider scaling if that's potentially a pain point in the lab, or if you have it available to you, take a look at core services that the organization or institution offers and see if they would be able to perform some of the work kind of as needed within the lab as well. And then lastly, if you're planning to purchase new equipment, understand what that purchasing process is and how long it might take for a new -80 or flow cytometer, for example, to come in, right? Oftentimes with those large purchases, they can take many months. And so worthwhile understanding that process before you get started as well. So another thing that can cause change within laboratories are new regulatory requirements. And this can be triggered by having those new projects with potentially different materials that need more compliance or regulations around them, such as handling the human samples from clinical trials, wanting to be HIPAA compliant or feed into a GXP lab. Making sure that you know of any internal factors. Is the lab looking to get CLIA certified this year? And that probably is going to introduce some changes around regulations that are needed, as well as any external body changes. So as I mentioned before, something like the new NIH data management and sharing policy that's come out this year has already caused a lot of labs to start changing the way that they're managing the data within their laboratories. So some downstream impacts of having new or updated regulations is training staff and making sure that they're aware of those and that they're able to abide by those regulations. Materials tracking, so changes in what you might need to log or how you're logging the materials that you have within the lab. And additionally, again, sort of those documentation needs. So making sure that you're capturing the work in a way that abides by the regulatory body that you're considering. So for staff training and awareness, the best thing to do is to create this collaborative environment so everybody can understand those regulations together. You're going to get a lot more compliance if people feel empowered to look into these regulations and understand them as they're considering experiments or work within their lab. And the very first thing really to do is know what regulations are pertaining to your lab. So there's lots of different things out there that I've just listed a couple of them here. So making sure you really know what pertains to you and then what's important in that regulation for your laboratory. Work with lab members to make sure that you guys are developing those policies and procedures together that align with those regulatory expectations. And this, again, will really help with compliance of those regulations as people have kind of a stake in what has happened around those changes. Create a culture of sharing knowledge to help promote new ideas on how to better abide by regulations or promote efficiency within the lab to really gain compliance by folks in the lab. And some tips on regulating sort of tracking of materials in a regulatory way. Create or implement a system that can help you answer the questions that auditors are interested in. So really it's sort of the what, when, how, who, and where. What, of course, is sort of the sample or material that you're working with. So if you're looking at a given tube, are you able to identify that in some way? Are you able to figure out if that sample is infectious or has other properties that might be required by the regulatory body to track? When, so ensuring that the system that you implement has timestamps or you're recording time on when things are happening to those samples, such as when it was received or processed or stored within the lab, being able to manage incubation times, things like that. How the work was performed, so being able to indicate, how you might have extracted DNA from a given sample or how the aliquoting process happened is always going to be useful. Of course, who did the work is also very important, as well as where these materials are. So if we do a spot check within the lab, would you be able to identify 5 to 10 samples and their location kind of in a random spot check? And when we're talking about sort of the regulatory documentation piece of it, again, like SOPs are kind of come into play here. Making sure that you have standardized documentation is really going to help with audits and additionally support that lab work, as we kind of talked about before. In terms of sort of SOP tips for regulatory documentation, I have a few more. Making sure that you actually create an SOP on how to create and update SOPs is really important. And this is gonna help labs later as they're scaling and creating potentially new SOPs every month, to have a system in place on how to do that. Again, sort of encouraging people to get involved with this process is going to ensure compliance with those SOPs, as well as SOPs that really reflect what's actually happening within the laboratory. And then make sure that you also have a system to share those SOPs, and those are readily available for people as they're doing their experiments within the lab. Additionally, in terms of documentation that might be required is standardization of the lab work itself. So this could be in the form of worksheets that are associated with SOPs, making sure that data capture is standardized among those worksheets, implementing or adopting a new system for electronic lab notebooks is a very common way to ensure that you get standardization, as well as abide by some of the fair data practices that might be needed by some of these regulatory bodies. And then lastly, ensure that you have a way to capture deviations and changes in the data, whether it be sort of writing it down and then systematically reviewing those, or having that be incorporated in your electronic laboratory notebook. So our last change to sort of review is around staff turnover and growth. And this is not really something that anybody likes to talk about generally, especially when you might be losing staff, but this can be both a good thing in terms of getting new staff as well, in terms of a laboratory expansion or potentially those grad student rotations. Things to be aware of as this shift in staff happens is the potential loss of samples, data, or even laboratory knowledge, potential delays in experiments or timelines that you have for projects, making sure that there is ample training for people within the lab, as well as being able to, protect against, but also work with the sort of the natural lab shift that will likely happen with changes in staff. So when we're talking about staff turnover, really, the primary goal here is to try and protect against that data loss and loss of knowledge, and potentially delaying projects as much as possible. So if you're able to create systems that sort of standardize and centralize the data, it allows for sort of data traceability, this ability to find the data that's needed in an easy way. Again, kind of looking at those fair data practices, being able to clearly identify and understand all of the information around sort of given data or samples at any given time. And then as folks are leaving, making sure that you're creating a plan to cross-train if you can, and as necessary. And then to also set sort of an exit interview to help identify where the key data and samples might be stored, that individual created or participated in generating. And for onboarding new staff, creating easy systems is really going to help with ramp up efficiency and allow for those projects to start and get worked on as quickly as possible. So again, creating standardization via SOPs, making sure that any new staff are trained on those SOPs and feel comfortable with those. If you have any systems or software, training them on those systems as well. And then, of course, making it really easy. So if it's easy, people are likely to pick it up quickly. They're also likely to use it more quickly. So design those systems that really are helping support the work rather than feeling like arbitrarily adding more work to people's plate, as well as encouraging an atmosphere where data integrity is kind of the utmost importance within the laboratory. So if you took nothing away from this talk so far, I think this is kind of the slide that I like people to pay attention to most, is really setting this plan for growth. And that is establishing that baseline as we discussed before, making sure that you're implementing but also optimizing processes, and that could be anywhere from the SOPs to the types of systems that you're using within the lab, and expand where needed, right? This is, it's inevitable in some cases that there may need to be additional equipment or staff hired to manage the change or the growth that might be happening within the lab. Simplify where you can. So if there are places where you can identify places to streamline, help make your team as efficient as possible. And then lastly, really find a system that's going to scale with you. And this is where software can really help teams. And as you're kind of making these assessments, it's really important to choose the right system that is going to help support your lab long term. As you are looking to implement or purchase a new system, ensuring that you understand what the must-have features are in the lab, as well as a tool that is going to grow with you. So, having the must-have as well as nice to have is going to help with that flexibility and further growth in the future that you may not even be aware of yet. Finding a vendor that is interested in your success and really a vendor that is going to be a partner with you rather than just kind of interested in selling you software. Making sure that you're getting those team members involved again. The largest thing that we hear kind of on the customer side is, I'm worried my lab is not going to like this. And the best thing to do is get those lab members involved, have them evaluate and participate in the decision-making of the software that's going to be chosen, and get something that they're going to be really excited about using. So of course, I think Sample Manager at LabKey is a great product for labs looking to get started with managing their data as well as sort of supporting growth in the future. It is a really easy to use software with a lot of flexibility to help meet the requirements that you may have within your laboratory. We allow for sort of full chain of custody and sample tracking within the system, as well as the flexibility of defining your own metadata on these samples to track all of the separate information that's important to you. We support barcoding and creation of those unique human readable sample IDs for sort of easy findability and retrievability of data. We also help teams standardize their work by creating sort of templatized task-based workflows to help accurately reflect sort of the work happening within the lab and your SOPs. We also retain those records of the complete life cycle of each sample. So instead of having to sort of traipse through an audit log when a sample has been discarded, we retain those in sort of the forefront and allow people to find them very quickly. We also have integrated and auditable management of freezers and sample storage. So being able to answer kind of that where question very easily within the system. And so I think actually, instead of going into our Q&A section, and feel free, please, to add any of your questions in the chat. I actually am going to do a quick demo, I think, of sample manager and kind of show you a few of those things that I was just talking about. So this is our sample manager dashboard. It is reviewing kind of the number of samples and the different types of samples that me as an administrator have created within the system. I also get to see kind of the different statuses of those samples. Again, something that's configurable and flexible to teams. I get to see the integrated ELN that we have within the system, the notebooks that I'm working on, any submissions or reviews that I need to have. I get a quick view of all the storage that I have within my laboratory, as well as any work that's been assigned to me that needs to be done. Some kind of highlights here is looking at individual samples and being able to see those timelines of samples within the system. So if I click on one of these here, I'm able to see kind of the notebooks that are associated with this sample, as well as sort of that customized and flexible metadata. But I really get to see the chain of custody of this blood sample and everything that's happened to it since it was registered. So I registered it in September of last year, and Steve has made some updates with any of these events. I get to kind of look at the update and see exactly what was changed, when, and by whom. For these samples as well, I can see where they are in storage. We have a very flexible, built-to-purpose freezer and storage management tool with flexible storage options with freezers as well as room temperature storage. I have the ability to create my own box sizes to match what's happening in the lab. I can examine sort of individual samples within my box. I can export manifests. I can do all the things sort of a typical freezer management system could do, such as checking in and out, moving samples, moving entire boxes or racks in case a freezer gets down. And of course, all of that is sort of audited and logged as well. We talked a lot about SOPs, and so I want to take a look at our workflow job list, and I can see all of the work that has kind of happened within this lab or the work that is currently ongoing with my active jobs. We have templatized most of our work, so we have specific workflows that capture what needs to be done for PBMC isolation and shipment of samples. I have a record of what samples were included within each of those and who is performing or who performed the work. Another great way to sort of standardize and track the work that I'm doing in my lab is with our data connected electronic laboratory notebook. And what's really unique about our laboratory notebook is that we do allow for multiple co-authors to reflect the reality of the work within the lab. So we can add more authors to work as needed. I also have the ability to kind of create my own entries and templatize those, as well as being able to reference the data within my system. And so I always have a direct reference to samples, assay data, other notebooks even that I have within my system to fully capture the work that I've done within the lab. And if you're interested in learning more, I'd love for you to sign up for a demo and we can go over this in a little bit more detail. But I think for now, we'll kind of go into the Q&A section. And so I'll take a look at some of the questions here. Feel free again to sort of ask them in the chat. Yeah, so somebody asked if we have any case studies, and we do have a number of case studies. We actually have a number of user presentations that people have done for us as well that sort of capture the different use cases of how people have used Sample Manager in the lab. This person is also asking about untraditional sample types. And yes, we accommodate this very well, actually, with our system. What I showed in the quick sort of demo was very clinical based, but that's really only because of my background and I was the administrator. But all of the language around sort of what samples are being used and the metadata around those is flexible to the type of work that people are doing. So we have a lot of flexibility in that way. Some other questions that we have here is how might someone get Sample Manager? We are a cloud-based software company for the most part, and so it is very easy to acquire Sample Manager for your lab. If you follow a link, I think Will's going to put a link to sort of the demo in chat here. You can set up a demo with me and we can get you started as quickly as you need to be. Other questions? Yeah, on compliance here. So we do offer HIPAA compliant servers as well with Sample Manager. We also are Part 11, CFR Part 11 compliant with our audit logging, as well as our e-signatures on the ELN review process. Yes, LabKey does help track inventory on reagents at the moment. And so we have a lot of clients that are using Sample Manager to track their inventory and reagents. And I'd be happy to talk more with you about that. Yes, so aliquots and sub-aliquots are sort of managed within the software very easily. It's actually quite easy to create aliquots within the system, and we have a really cool functionality with that allows you to sort of roll up all of the information about aliquots on a primary sample as well. So you're always sort of tracking the work that has been done kind of on a single primary sample too. And happy to sort of demo that more as well. Okay, great. Yep, and it looks like Will was able to add that link. Yeah, the Sample Manager software is a yearly subscription, and so we often have labs that will choose to purchase a year-long license or actually a multi-year license for sort of that stability within the laboratory. Any other questions? And so, yeah, our software is actually per user pricing. And so in that case, you can really scale the usage for the lab as it's needed and that growth within the lab. Okay. So again, I'll kind of encourage folks to click on the link that Will put in the chat. Please set up a demo with me. I'm happy to talk about this more, and we can go from there. Thank you so much.